Commander Sarah Chun stood at the observation deck of the human diplomatic vessel Defiance, watching the massive ring structure of the Galactic Council chambers grow larger through the reinforced transparent steel. The ancient construct hung in the void like a golden crown, its surface gleaming with the light of 3 different stars. Thousands of ships from across the galaxy surrounded it, representing hundreds of species that had gathered for what many considered the most important trial in galactic history. "Nervous?" asked Dr. Marcus Webb, the human xenobiologist who had been assigned as her scientific advisor. His weathered face showed the strain of the past 3 months since humanity had been summoned before the Council. Sarah's jaw tightened as she watched a formation of Zephyrian warships patrol the perimeter. Their crystalline hulls caught and reflected the starlight in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "I should be. But, honestly, Marcus, I'm more angry than nervous." The charges against humanity were unprecedented in scope and severity. Crimes against galactic order, violations of the Natural Development Protocol, contamination of primitive species, unauthorized expansion beyond designated sectors. The list went on for pages, each accusation more damning than the last. What made it worse was that most of the charges were technically true. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for exactly 47 years, ever since the Altarian Empire had discovered Earth and decided that humans showed enough potential to warrant uplifting to galactic civilization. It had been presented as a gift, a benevolent gesture from an advanced species to help guide humanity into a broader universe. Sarah had been just a child then, but she remembered the celebrations, the hope, the sense that humanity was finally joining something greater than itself. The reality had been different. The gift came with strings attached. Humanity was assigned to a small sector in the galactic rim, far from the centers of power and trade. They were given access to basic faster-than-light travel, but only ships approved by the Council. They could trade, but only with species and for goods that the Council deemed appropriate. They could explore, but only in directions the Council specified. Most importantly, they were forbidden from making contact with any species that had not already been inducted into the Council. For the first 20 years, humanity had played by the rules. They had been grateful students, eager to learn and prove themselves worthy of their place among the stars. They established colonies in their assigned sector, developed new technologies within the approved parameters, and contributed what they could to galactic civilization. Some humans even gained positions of minor responsibility within Council bureaucracy. But humanity's nature eventually asserted itself. They were explorers by DNA and conquerors by instinct, traits that had carried them from the African savanna to every corner of Earth and now into space. The boundaries set by the Council began to chafe. The restrictions felt less like guidance and more like chains. The first violation had been almost accidental. A human exploration ship, the Pioneer, had suffered a navigation malfunction and emerged from hyperspace in an uncharted system. There they found the Kythera, a species of aquatic beings who had just developed rudimentary spaceflight, but had not yet been contacted by the Council. Protocol demanded that the humans leave immediately and report the discovery to Council authorities. Instead, Captain James Morrison had made first contact. The Kythera were dying. Their homeworld's ocean was becoming increasingly acidic due to volcanic activity, and they lacked the technology to save themselves or evacuate their population. Morrison had made a choice that would echo across the galaxy. He had shared human atmospheric processing technology, helping the Kythera stabilize their world and save billions of lives. When the Council discovered the violation 6 months later, Morrison was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment on a penal colony. The Kythera were forcibly relocated to a more suitable world where they could be properly integrated into galactic civilization. Half of them died during the forced migration. That had been the beginning of humanity's rebellion against Council authority. Sarah's reflection was interrupted by the approach of her aide, Lieutenant Commander Torres. "Ma'am, we're receiving docking instructions from Council Traffic Control." Bay 94B, Level 7. We're also getting reports from our intelligence assets. Sarah turned away from the viewport. What are they saying? Torres's expression was grim. It's not good, ma'am. The hegemony faction has been pushing hard for what they call the final solution. Complete removal of humanity from the galaxy. The hegemony was the most powerful voting bloc within the council, comprised of the oldest and most technologically advanced species. They viewed humanity as a dangerous aberration, a young and aggressive species that threatened the careful stability they had maintained for millennia. The fact that humans had managed to liberate 6 different species from council authority in the past 15 years had only strengthened their resolve. What about our allies? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. The Altarians are still supporting us publicly, but our sources suggest they're wavering. The peaceful coalition is split. Some want to support us, others think we've gone too far. The Frontier Alliance is with us, but they don't have enough votes to matter. Sarah nodded grimly. The political mathematics had been clear from the beginning. Humanity had few friends in the galaxy, and most of those were either powerless or had their own reasons for opposing council authority. The species they had liberated, the Kythera, the Valdris, the Solarans, and others, weren't even allowed to vote on humanity's fate since they were considered contaminated by human influence. The docking procedure was smooth and efficient, exactly what one would expect from a civilization that had been managing interstellar affairs for over 10,000 years. As the Defiance settled into its assigned berth, Sarah could see representatives from dozens of species preparing for the trial. The corridors of the council chambers were a riot of color and form. The crystalline Zephyrians, the floating gas bag Luminous, the insectoid hive speakers, the cybernetic synthesis, and hundreds of others. Most of them looked at the humans with expressions that ranged from disdain to outright hostility. The council chambers themselves were a marvel of engineering and diplomacy. The central hall was a massive sphere, with seating arranged in concentric rings that accommodated beings of every conceivable physiology. The accused stood on a platform in the center, while the judges, representatives of the 12 most senior species, occupied an elevated dais that rotated slowly to ensure equal visibility to all observers. Sarah stood on that central platform alongside the rest of humanity's delegation. Dr. Webb, Ambassador Patricia Reynolds, General Harrison Clark, and 3 other officials who represented different aspects of human civilization. Around them, holographic displays showed evidence of humanity's crimes, recordings of first contact violations, unauthorized technology transfers, military actions against council forces, and the establishment of what the prosecution called rogue colonies. High Judge Zarthal of the Eternal Throne began the proceedings with a voice that resonated through multiple spectrums simultaneously. The translation devices rendered his words in crisp, emotionless human English. The Galactic Council is now in session. We are gathered to consider the fate of the species known as humanity, accused of multiple violations of galactic law and order. The prosecution may begin. The prosecutor was Advocate Prime Veltar of the Hegemony, a being whose species had been part of the council for over 5,000 years. Her presentation was methodical and devastating. She detailed every violation, every act of rebellion, every instance where humanity had chosen its own path over council authority. She showed recordings of human ships attacking council vessels, of human colonists refusing evacuation orders, of human diplomats openly defying council decisions. The pattern is clear, Veltar concluded, her translated voice carrying undertones of disgust. Humanity is fundamentally incompatible with galactic civilization. They're a chaotic element that threatens the peace and stability we have worked millennia to achieve. They cannot be reformed, they cannot be contained, and they cannot be trusted. For the safety of all galactic citizens, they must be removed. The evidence was overwhelming because it was largely true. Humanity had violated council law repeatedly and systematically. They had made unauthorized contact with dozens of species. They had shared technology beyond approved parameters. They had established colonies in forbidden sectors. They had even fought open wars with Council forces when attempts were made to force their compliance. But Sarah knew there was another side to the story. When Ambassador Reynolds stood to present humanity's defense, the chamber fell silent. She was a small woman, barely reaching the shoulder of most other species representatives, but she commanded attention through sheer presence. "Honored judges," she began, "the prosecution has presented an accurate but incomplete picture. Yes, humanity has violated Council law. We do not deny this, but we ask that you consider why these violations occurred and what they achieved." The holographic displays changed, now showing images that the prosecution had not included. Kythera children playing in clean oceans. Valdres artists creating magnificent sculptures in low gravity that their homeworld could not provide. Solaran scientists making breakthrough discoveries in stellar engineering. The faces of billions of beings who were alive and thriving because humanity had chosen compassion over compliance. "Every violation they have cited saved lives," Reynolds continued. "The Kythera were dying when we found them. Council protocol would have left them to extinction while paperwork was processed. The Valdres were trapped in a deteriorating stellar system, but Council regulations prohibited their relocation because they hadn't earned membership yet. The Solarans were enslaved by the Torgon Empire, but the Council classified this as an internal affair that didn't warrant intervention." She gestured to the displays showing thriving human colonies in supposedly forbidden sectors. "We established these colonies not to defy the Council, but because we found systems that were empty, suitable for life, and desperately needed by our growing population. We followed all environmental protocols. We harmed no existing life. We simply refused to accept that arbitrary lines drawn on galactic maps should condemn our children to overcrowded worlds and limited futures." The chamber remained silent, but Sarah could sense shifting undercurrents in the massive audience. Some species were nodding slightly. Others seemed unmoved. The hegemony representatives looked openly disdainful. Reynolds pressed on. "We are told that we are chaotic, dangerous, incompatible with galactic civilization. But look at what we have actually done. Every species we have contacted is healthier, more prosperous, and more free than they were before. The colonies we have established have become centers of trade, research, and cultural exchange. The technologies we have shared have led to medical breakthroughs, agricultural improvements, and scientific discoveries that benefit everyone." High Judge Zarthal interrupted with a sound like grinding stone. "The defense ignores the fundamental issue. Laws exist for reasons beyond immediate results. Order must be maintained. Precedent must be respected. If every species decided to ignore Council authority whenever they disagreed with it, galactic civilization would collapse into chaos." Sarah felt her anger building. She had listened to 47 years of lectures about order and precedent while watching the Council ignore suffering, prevent progress, and maintain a system that benefited the oldest and most powerful species at the expense of everyone else. The great galactic civilization was built on stagnation, enforced by bureaucracy, and sustained by fear. "What order?" Sarah said, stepping forward before Reynolds could stop her. The translation systems carried her voice throughout the chamber. "What civilization are we supposedly protecting? A system where species are ranked by age instead of contribution? Where suffering is ignored if it doesn't affect the right people? Where exploration and growth are treated as crimes?" Murmurs swept through the chamber. Speaking out of turn was a serious breach of protocol, but Sarah was beyond caring about protocol. "You call us chaotic," she continued, "but we have brought more positive change to this galaxy in 47 years than your order system has managed in 5,000. You call us dangerous, but the only beings we have ever fought were those who try to impose suffering on the innocent. You call us incompatible with galactic civilization, but maybe the problem isn't us. Maybe the problem is that your civilization has forgotten what it means to be alive." The chamber erupted. Representatives were on their feet, some shouting support, others demanding Sarah's immediate arrest for contempt. The judges called for order repeatedly, their voices booming through the translation systems. Through the chaos, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected: hope in the faces of some representatives, particularly those from younger or less powerful species. But she also saw cold fury in the eyes of the hegemony faction. They had already made their decision, and her words had only strengthened their resolve. High Judge Zarthal's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The accused will remain silent or be removed from these proceedings. The defense will control their delegation or face sanctions. The chamber gradually quieted, but the tension remained electric. Ambassador Reynolds shot Sarah a look that promised a serious conversation later, then continued with the formal defense. She presented character witnesses, species that had benefited from human contact. She showed economic data proving that human-influenced regions had higher prosperity and growth rates. She even produced testimony from council officials who privately admitted that many of humanity's violations had led to positive outcomes. But Sarah could feel the mood in the chamber. The evidence didn't matter. The politics had been decided before the trial began. The hegemony had the votes, and they were determined to make an example of humanity that would prevent any other young species from following the same path. The trial continued for 3 days. Witnesses testified for both sides. Experts presented analyses of human behavior and its impact on galactic society. Philosophers debated the nature of law versus justice. Through it all, Sarah watched the faces of the judges and knew that nothing being said would change the outcome. On the afternoon of the third day, High Judge Zarthal called for final statements. Advocate Prime Veltar reiterated her arguments for humanity's removal, emphasizing the threat they pose to galactic order. Ambassador Reynolds made an impassioned plea for mercy, arguing that humanity's positive contributions outweighed their violations, and that exile would be both unjust and wasteful. As the judges retired to deliberate, Sarah found herself alone on the observation deck of the Defiance. The same view of the council chambers that had greeted her arrival now seemed different. The golden ring looked less like a crown and more like a cage, beautiful but confining. Dr. Webb joined her at the viewport. "You know," he said quietly, "I've spent the last 3 days listening to testimony about human nature. Everyone seems to think they understand us better than we understand ourselves." Sarah nodded. "They see us as either dangerous animals or noble savages. They can't conceive that we might simply be different." Different how? Sarah considered the question. Around them, the lights of hundreds of species ships created a constellation of diversity that should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt sterile, controlled, limited by ancient fears and outdated thinking. "We dream," she said finally. "All these species, all this advanced technology, all this accumulated wisdom, and they've forgotten how to dream of something better. They're so focused on maintaining what they have that they can't imagine what they could become." The announcement came 6 hours later. The council had reached its decision. Sarah stood once again on the central platform as High Judge Zarthal delivered the verdict. The chamber was packed beyond capacity, with the overflow watching through holographic feeds across the galaxy. Representatives of species that had been contacted by humans watched with particular interest, knowing that the decision would affect them as well. After careful deliberation, Zarthal intoned, "The Council finds humanity guilty of systematic violation of galactic law. The evidence is overwhelming and the pattern is clear. However, in recognition of testimony regarding positive outcomes from some human actions, the Council has decided on a sentence of exile rather than elimination." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Exile sounded better than elimination, but she suspected the details would be far worse than the mild term suggested. All human colonies outside designated sectors will be evacuated. All human technology above approved levels will be confiscated. All species contacted by humans in violation of protocol will be relocated to appropriate supervision. Humanity itself will be relocated to a designated system where they can develop according to their nature without threatening galactic stability. The designated system, Sarah soon learned, was a single star with two marginally habitable worlds in a region of space that was isolated from all major trade routes and hyperlane networks. It was effectively a prison system designed to contain all of humanity within a volume of space that would prevent them from ever again making unauthorized contact with other species. The relocations mentioned in the sentence were death sentences for the species humanity had tried to help. The Kithira would be moved again, despite the fact that the previous forced relocation had killed half their population. The Valdris would be returned to their dying system. The Solarans would be handed back to their former masters. Billions would die to maintain the Council's interpretation of order. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Sarah made a decision that would haunt the galaxy for generations to come. She activated the emergency beacon hidden in her uniform collar. The signal was transmitted on a frequency that only one ship in the galaxy was monitoring. The ship that officially didn't exist, crewed by volunteers who had officially died in various accidents and battles. The ship that had been preparing for this moment since the day the trial was announced. 3 light years away, Captain Elena Vasquez received the signal and smiled grimly. She turned to her crew, a mix of humans and representatives from the species humanity had liberated. Signal received, she announced. The Council has made its choice. Now it's time for them to live with the consequences. The Nemesis began its approach to the Council chambers. In its cargo holds, it carried something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Proof that humanity had been keeping secrets, developing technologies that the Council had never imagined, preparing for the day when diplomacy would fail and more direct action would be necessary. The trial was over. The verdict had been rendered. But the real conflict was just beginning. The alarm klaxons began wailing throughout the Council chambers exactly 17 minutes after the verdict was announced. Emergency lighting bathed the golden corridors in harsh red as automated systems detected what they classified as an approaching threat. In the main control center, Coordinator Thexanael stared at sensor readings that shouldn't have been possible. Single vessel, bearing 27 Mark 8, velocity impossible to determine, reported the sensor operator, a young Altarian whose scales were shifting to deep purple in distress. Sir, the readings don't make sense. It's moving faster than anything in our databases, but it's not using any known propulsion signature. Coordinator Thexanael had been managing traffic around the Council chambers for over 200 years. He had seen every type of ship produced by every member species, including experimental vessels that pushed the boundaries of known technology. This was something entirely different. Identify and hail, he ordered, though he suspected he already knew who was approaching. The response came not through normal communication channels, but as a direct transmission that somehow bypassed all security protocols and appeared directly on every screen in the control center. The image showed a human woman in a black uniform without rank insignia, standing on a bridge that looked nothing like the approved human ship designs on file with the Council. Council Control, this is Captain Elena Vasquez of the human vessel Nemesis. I'm requesting immediate docking clearance and an emergency session with the full Council Assembly. Negative. Thexanael responded immediately. All human vessels have been restricted from approaching Council space, pending implementation of the exile sentence. You will reverse course immediately or face interdiction. Captain Vasquez smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and terrifying. I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Coordinator. I have information that the Council needs to hear before they finalize their decision regarding humanity. Information that will change everything. The verdict has already been rendered and is final, Thexanael said, but even as he spoke, he was watching his tactical displays with growing alarm. The human ship was continuing its approach despite the presence of over 300 Council security vessels, including several dreadnoughts from the hegemony fleet. None of them seemed to be making any attempt to intercept. Sir, the tactical officer reported, his voice strained, our ships are reporting difficulties. Engine malfunctions, navigation errors, weapons systems going offline. It's affecting every vessel in the defense grid. Coordinator Thex and AL felt his blood temperature drop several degrees. Explain. We can't, sir. The problems are affecting different systems on different ships, but they're all experiencing some form of technical failure. And, sir, the failures began the moment the human vessel entered sensor range. On the main display, Captain Vasquez was still smiling. As you can see, Coordinator, I'm quite capable of ensuring my own safe passage. But I'm not here to fight. I'm here to talk. 1 hour of the Council's time, and I'll share information that will save billions of lives. Throughout the Council chambers, representatives were receiving emergency briefings from their security advisors. The sudden appearance of an advanced human vessel had triggered protocols that hadn't been used in centuries. Emergency sessions were being called, while military commanders demanded immediate action against what they saw as an obvious threat. In his private chambers, High Judge Zarthal was reviewing the situation with growing unease. His species, the Eternal Throne, had been part of the Council since its founding. They had seen the rise and fall of hundreds of civilizations, had guided the development of galactic society through wars, plagues, and natural disasters. In all that time, they had never encountered a situation quite like this. The human ship is holding position at the edge of our defense perimeter, reported his aide, a younger member of his species whose natural crystalline formations were flickering with stress patterns. Our security forces are unable to approach due to unexplained technical failures. Intelligence reports suggest the vessel is using some form of advanced electronic warfare technology. Electronic warfare? Zarthal's voice carried harmonics of concern. Humans have never demonstrated such capabilities. That appears to be incorrect, Your Honor. Analysis of the ship's design suggests technology far beyond what we believe humans possessed. The vessel itself appears to be using some form of exotic matter manipulation for propulsion, and its hull composition includes materials we cannot identify. Zarthal considered this information. The trial had been based on the assumption that humanity, while troublesome, was still a relatively primitive species that could be managed through traditional means. If they possessed technology that could neutralize an entire Council defense fleet without firing a shot, the political calculus changed dramatically. Convene an emergency session, he ordered. All judges, full assembly, and extend the human captain an invitation to address the Council. Meanwhile, aboard the Defiance, Sarah Chan was watching the unfolding situation with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had activated the beacon, but she hadn't known exactly what response it would trigger. The appearance of the Nemesis answered some questions while raising dozens of others. Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Torres approached with a communication device. We're receiving a tight beam transmission from the approaching vessel. Audio only, encrypted with codes that shouldn't exist. Sarah accepted the device and activated the connection. A familiar voice filled her ear, speaking words that sent chills down her spine. Hello, Sarah. This is Elena. I know you have questions, and I promise I'll answer them all soon. But right now, I need you to trust me and follow my lead. The Council is about to learn that they've made a very serious mistake. The emergency session convened in the main assembly hall with unprecedented speed. Representatives from every member species crowded into seats, while security forces maintained a nervous perimeter. The human delegation was escorted to the central platform under heavy guard, while additional security monitors tracked the Nemesis, maintaining its position outside the station. High Judge Zarthal called the session to order with a voice that carried more tension than usual. The Council recognizes Captain Elena Vasquez of the human vessel Nemesis. You have requested this emergency session. State your business. The holographic projector in the center of the chamber activated, displaying Captain Vasquez's image in full detail. She appeared relaxed and confident, standing on a bridge that incorporated design elements no Council analyst could immediately identify. Honored judges, representatives of the galactic community, she began, I come before you today to prevent a catastrophe that will consume us all. The verdict you have rendered against humanity is based on incomplete information. Before you implement your sentence, you need to understand the true nature of the threat we all face. Advocate Prime Veltar rose from her seat. This is a transparent attempt to delay the implementation of a legally rendered verdict. The accused have had ample opportunity to present their case. Captain Vasquez turned her attention to Veltar with a look that made the hegemony advocate step back involuntarily. My dear Advocate Prime, you are about to discover that legal verdicts become irrelevant when faced with extinction. But please allow me to begin with a simple question. How long has the hegemony been monitoring the approach of the devourers? The chamber fell silent. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she recognized the name from classified intelligence briefings that only the highest levels of government were supposed to know about. Veltar's crystalline features shifted through several color phases before settling on a pale blue that indicated extreme stress. That information is classified at the highest levels. No human should have access to intelligence about the extragalactic invasion force that has been approaching our galaxy for the past 12 years. Captain Vasquez interrupted. The same invasion force that your scientists calculate will arrive within the next 18 months? The same force that has already consumed 3 neighboring galaxies and shows no signs of slowing down. The chaos that erupted in the chamber was immediate and complete. Representatives demanded explanations. Security forces attempted to identify information leaks, and several species began emergency consultations with their home governments. Through it all, Captain Vasquez waited patiently for the noise to die down. High Judge Zarthul restored order through sheer volume, his voice booming across multiple spectrums simultaneously. Explain how you have access to this information. Because, Your Honor, humanity has been preparing for this invasion since before we were even contacted by the Council. You see, there's something about human development that your first contact protocols failed to detect. Something that makes us unique among galactic civilizations. The display changed, showing images of deep space observation stations and massive computational arrays. But these weren't human designs from any official records. They were clearly more advanced, incorporating technology that shouldn't have existed. 47 years ago, when the Altarians discovered Earth, we were already watching them approach. We had detected their ships 3 years before they entered our solar system. We knew about the Council, about galactic civilization, about the political structures that governed interstellar society. We also knew about the approaching devourers. Dr. Webb leaned forward from his position on the platform, his scientific mind racing to process the implications. Elena, how is that possible? Our detection technology in those days barely reached the outer planets. Captain Vasquez's expression became almost sad. Marcus, I'm sorry we couldn't tell you. I'm sorry we couldn't tell any of you. But the secret had to be maintained to protect both humanity and the galaxy itself. The display shifted again, showing what appeared to be underground facilities on Earth, Mars, and several other human worlds. The scale was enormous, with construction projects that must have required decades of work and resources that dwarfed anything in the public records. The truth is that humans have been preparing for this invasion for over a century. Our species has a unique capability that we've kept hidden from galactic society. We can detect and process quantum resonance patterns across interstellar distances. It's a latent psychic ability that manifests in about 1 in every million humans. We call them listeners. Sarah stared at the images, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about human capabilities. Psychic abilities? That's impossible. We've been tested by council psychologists dozens of times. Because we taught them to hide their abilities, Captain Vasquez replied. Every human delegation to the Council has included at least 3 listeners whose job was to monitor Council activities and ensure that our secret remained protected. They've been reporting back to a shadow government that has existed alongside our official administration since first contact. The implications were staggering. It meant that every diplomatic meeting, every trade negotiation, every political decision involving humanity had been monitored by psychic agents. It meant that humanity's apparent compliance with Council authority had been a carefully orchestrated deception spanning nearly 5 decades. But it also raised an obvious question that High Judge Zarthal was quick to voice. If humanity has possessed such capabilities all along, why did you not reveal this information sooner? Why allow this trial to proceed? Captain Vasquez's smile became grim. Because we needed to know who we could trust when the real crisis arrived. The Devourers aren't just a military threat, Your Honor. They're a psychic plague that corrupts and consumes every civilization they encounter. They turn advanced species against each other, use political divisions to weaken resistance, and exploit the very diversity that makes galactic civilization possible. The display changed once more, showing astronomical data that made several representatives gasp in horror. Star systems going dark in sequence, massive energy signatures moving between galaxies, and, most disturbing of all, transmissions from the consumed regions that showed familiar species broadcasting surrender demands to their former allies. The hegemony has known about this threat for 12 years, Captain Vasquez continued, but they've chosen to keep it secret rather than risk panic or political instability. They've been developing defensive measures in private while maintaining the illusion of galactic peace. Unfortunately, their approach is doomed to failure. Veltar stood again, her crystalline form now shifting rapidly through stress patterns. These are lies and deceptions designed to undermine legitimate authority. Even if such a threat existed, which we neither confirm nor deny, it would be handled through proper channels and established protocols. Chanels. Captain Vasquez laughed, a sound that somehow carried menace despite its apparent humor. Advocate Prime, your proper channels consist of committee hearings that take months to reach decisions, resource allocation debates that prioritize political considerations over practical needs, and defensive strategies that assume your enemies will politely follow the same rules of engagement that have governed galactic warfare for the past 5,000 years. She gestured to the astronomical data still displayed around the chamber. The Devourers don't follow your rules. They don't respect your territorial boundaries or your diplomatic immunities. They don't care about your ancient traditions or your carefully balanced political alliances. They consume everything in their path, and they're very good at it. And I suppose humanity has a solution? High Judge Zarthal asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. We do, but it requires abandoning everything the Council thinks it knows about warfare, diplomacy, and galactic defense. It requires accepting that the old rules no longer apply, and that survival will demand choices that your civilization has spent millennia trying to avoid. The chamber buzzed with tension as representatives processed this information. Several species were already conducting emergency consultations with their home governments, while others were demanding immediate verification of the claims about the Devourers. The political alliances that had seemed so important during the trial were beginning to fracture as the scope of the real crisis became clear. Captain Vasquez allowed the discussion to continue for several minutes before raising her voice again. I understand that this is difficult information to process. The revelation that your greatest fears about humanity were both wrong and irrelevant in the face of a much larger threat will require significant adjustments in thinking. But we don't have much time. She gestured, and the display showed new data, fleet movements, resource allocations, and what appeared to be massive construction projects scattered across human space. For the past 20 years, while officially complying with Council restrictions, humanity has been building a defense network specifically designed to counter the Devourer threat. We have ships that can operate independently of traditional supply lines, weapons that target psychic manipulation systems, and, most importantly, personnel who are immune to the mind control techniques that make the Devourers so effective. Dr. Webb was staring at the display with growing excitement and horror. The psychological profiling. All those personality tests we've had to take over the years were designed to identify humans with natural resistance to psychic influence, Captain Vasquez confirmed. About 15% of our population shows some level of immunity, with another 30% demonstrating trainable resistance. It makes us uniquely qualified to fight an enemy that has conquered every other civilization they've encountered. The political implications were becoming clear to everyone in the chamber. Humanity wasn't just a rebellious young species that needed to be controlled. They were potentially the galaxy's only hope of survival against an existential threat. The careful power balance that the hegemony had maintained for millennia was about to become irrelevant. But Veltar wasn't ready to concede defeat. Even assuming these claims are accurate, which we do not accept, humanity's record of violations and aggressive behavior demonstrates that they cannot be trusted with such responsibilities. They would use this crisis to impose their own vision of galactic society. Captain Vasquez studied the hegemony advocate for a long moment before responding. You're absolutely right, Advocate Prime. We would impose our vision of galactic society. A vision where suffering is addressed rather than ignored, where artificial limitations on growth and exploration are removed, and where the potential of every species is encouraged rather than suppressed. She gestured again, and the display showed footage from human-liberated worlds, the thriving Kythera colonies, the artistic achievements of the relocated Valdris, the scientific breakthroughs emerging from former Solaran slave populations. The species we have contaminated have achieved more in 15 years of freedom than they managed in centuries under Council supervision. Our vision of galactic society is based on the radical concept that beings should be allowed to reach their full potential. Veltar responded immediately. Uncontrolled growth, unregulated development, the collapse of social order. Progress, Sarah said, finally understanding the full scope of what had been hidden from her. You're describing progress, and you're afraid of it because it threatens your position at the top of the power structure. The confrontation might have continued, but it was interrupted by an urgent announcement from the station's sensor network. A new contact had appeared on the long-range detectors, moving at speeds that defied conventional physics and broadcasting signals that made the automated systems scream warnings about contamination and hostile intent. The Devourer's advanced scouts have arrived, Captain Vasquez announced calmly. 18 months ahead of schedule, which means their main force is much closer than anyone realized. The chamber erupted in panic as representatives demanded immediate evacuation while their security forces scrambled to respond to a threat they didn't understand. Through the chaos, Sarah found herself staring at Captain Vasquez's image and, finally, asking the question that had been building since the nemesis first appeared. What do you need from us? Captain Vasquez's smile was sad but determined. Everything, Sarah. We need the Council to officially rescind humanity's exile and grant us emergency authority to coordinate galactic defense. We need access to every ship, every resource, every piece of technology that might help us fight this war. And, most importantly, we need the Council to accept that the galaxy they've known for 5,000 years is about to end. And if we refuse? High Judge Zarthal asked, though his tone suggested he already knew that refusal was no longer an option. Captain Vasquez's expression hardened. Then, you'll discover what happens when humanity stops asking permission and starts taking what we need to save everyone's lives, including yours. The threat was delivered calmly, but its implications were clear to everyone in the chamber. Humanity had been playing by the Council's rules for 47 years while secretly building the capability to ignore those rules entirely. They had the technology, the resources, and, most importantly, the knowledge needed to fight the approaching invasion. The galaxy could accept human leadership voluntarily, or it could have that leadership imposed by force. Either way, the age of Council authority was ending, and the real war was about to begin. The scout ship materialized on the edge of the system like a bleeding wound in space itself. Its hull was a writhing mass of organic and technological components that defied conventional understanding of starship design. Sensor readings fluctuated wildly as the ship's very presence seemed to corrupt the quantum substrate of local space-time. In the Council Chamber's Emergency Command Center, Senior Tactical Analyst Krevtos stared at displays that hurt to look at directly. His species, the mathematical precision, had evolved to process vast amounts of sensory data simultaneously. But the readings from the Devourer scout ship made his neural pathways burn with pain. Psychic resonance cascade detected across all monitoring stations, he reported to the crisis management team. The ship's presence is inducing hallucinations in 17% of station personnel. Automated systems are experiencing spontaneous rewrites of their core programming. And, sir, he paused, his crystalline features darkening with distress. The ship is broadcasting surrender demands in languages that don't exist yet. Commander Velthara of the Station Defense Forces was experiencing her own technical difficulties. Her cybernetic implants, standard equipment for all senior military officers, were displaying error messages in scripts that seemed to writhe and change as she watched them. All ships maintain distance and defensive postures. Do not attempt direct engagement until we understand what we're dealing with. The order was unnecessary. Every Council vessel that had tried to approach the scout ship had suffered immediate system failures. Not damage from weapons fire, but wholesale corruption of their basic operating systems. Ships found themselves accelerating toward stars they couldn't see, firing on allies they couldn't identify, or simply shutting down as their computers decided that continued existence was an unacceptable error state. On the main assembly platform, Captain Vasquez watched the unfolding crisis with grim satisfaction. As you can see, traditional defensive measures are ineffective against Devourer technology. They don't just attack your ships and weapons. They attack your understanding of reality itself. High Judge Zarthal was experiencing his first direct exposure to psychic corruption. His ancient consciousness, normally a stable foundation of crystal clarity and logical process, was being bombarded with images and concepts that his mind rejected as impossible. He saw civilizations that had never existed, technologies that violated fundamental physical laws, and, most disturbing of all, versions of himself making decisions that filled him with inexplicable horror. "What are they?" he managed to ask, though his voice carried harmonics of distress that hadn't been heard from his species in millennia. The Devourers are what happens when a civilization becomes so advanced that they transcend the normal limitations of space and time, Captain Vasquez explained. They exist simultaneously across multiple realities, drawing resources and knowledge from infinite parallel universes. Every civilization they encounter becomes part of their collective consciousness, adding their distinctiveness to an ever-growing amalgamation of absorbed species. She gestured, and the displays showed historical data that made several representatives cry out in recognition. The Zephyrian Second Empire, the builders of the great monuments, the singing worlds of Euphonia. All civilizations that mysteriously vanished without trace over the past 50,000 years. The Council assumed they had transcended to higher planes of existence or destroyed themselves through technological excess. The truth is that they were consumed. Dr. Webb, struggling with his own psychic contamination, forced himself to focus on the scientific implications. But if they've been operating for that long, why are they only reaching our galaxy now? Because consumption takes time, Captain Vasquez replied. The Devourers don't just destroy civilizations. They integrate them, absorb their knowledge, adapt their technologies, and incorporate their psychic patterns into their collective consciousness. Each absorbed species makes them stronger and more capable. They've been moving from galaxy to galaxy for millions of years, growing more powerful with each conquest. The scout ship was broadcasting now, its signals penetrating every communication system in the Council chambers despite all attempts to block them. The translation matrices struggled to process languages that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, but fragments of meaning seeped through. Your resistance is acknowledged and appreciated. The fragmentary voice spoke in harmonics that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to consciousness. Your distinctiveness will add to our perfection. Your defiance will become our wisdom. Surrender is inevitable. Surrender is beautiful. Surrender is the highest form of evolution. Several representatives began moving toward the exits, their faces blank with artificial serenity. They weren't running in panic, but walking with purposeful calm toward docking bays where they intended to surrender themselves and their ships to the approaching threat. Security forces found themselves unable to stop them, as their own personnel began experiencing similar compulsions. "This is how they operate," Captain Vasquez continued, raising her voice over the growing chaos. "They don't need to fight massive space battles or overcome defensive fortifications. They simply convince your people that surrender is the logical choice, that resistance is futile and cooperation is beautiful. Within hours, your own population will be helping them catalog your resources and identify strategic targets." Sarah watched in horror as Lieutenant Commander Torres walked past her with her expression of blissful compliance, heading toward the docking bays with a group of other affected personnel. She tried to call out to him, but he showed no recognition of her voice. It was as if his personality had been overwritten by something else, something that found the idea of individual consciousness to be an amusing but obsolete concept. "Why aren't we affected?" she demanded. "Why aren't you under their influence?" Captain Vasquez smiled grimly. "Because humanity has been inoculating itself against psychic influence for the past century. Every human in this chamber has undergone cognitive enhancement designed to resist external mental manipulation. It's not perfect immunity, but it gives us enough protection to function in the presence of devourer technology." She turned to address the full assembly, many of whose members were now staring at the scout ship with expressions of growing fascination. "This is why the Council's exile sentence was not just wrong, but catastrophically stupid. You've just condemned the only species capable of fighting this threat to isolation and powerlessness. Congratulations on ensuring the extinction of galactic civilization." Advocate Prime Veltar was fighting her own battle against psychic corruption, her crystalline features shifting through patterns that indicated severe internal conflict. "Even if your claims about human immunity are accurate, you are still only one species. The Devourers have consumed entire galaxies. What could you possibly do against such power?" Captain Vasquez's expression became predatory. "We cheat." The display changed again, showing technical specifications that made the assembled scientists gasp in recognition and terror. Ships designed around principles that shouldn't have been possible, weapons that targeted consciousness itself, and, most shocking of all, technology that appeared to be based on devourer principles but somehow reversed. For the past 40 years, humanity has been studying every piece of devourer technology we could find. Crash scouts, psychic echoes, fragments of absorbed civilizations that manage to transmit final messages before being consumed. We've learned how their systems work, how their consciousness operates, and, most importantly, how to turn their own weapons against them. Dr. Webb was staring at technical readouts that hurt his mind to comprehend. "Elena, this technology, it's partially alive. Some of these systems appear to have conscious components." "They do," Captain Vasquez confirmed. "We've been growing hybrid consciousnesses for decades. Volunteer human psychics who allow their minds to be merged with captured devourer neural networks. They retain their human identity and resistance to external influence while gaining the ability to understand and manipulate devourer technology." The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just been preparing to fight the devourers. They had been transforming themselves into something capable of matching their enemy's capabilities. The careful genetic manipulation, the psychological conditioning, the hidden technological development, All of it had been building toward the creation of a hybrid human-devourer species that could fight corruption with corruption. You're talking about voluntary assimilation, High Judge Zarthal said, his voice carrying harmonics of horror. You're describing the deliberate sacrifice of human consciousness to create weapons. We're describing survival, Sarah said, finally, understanding the full scope of humanity's secret preparations. You think we're dangerous because we violate your laws and ignore your restrictions. But you never asked why we were willing to pay that price. We weren't rebelling against your authority for the sake of rebellion. We were preparing for a war that you refused to acknowledge existed. The scout ship was growing larger in the displays, its presence warping local space in ways that made the station's structural engineers recommend immediate evacuation. But more disturbing than its size was the fact that it wasn't alone anymore. Additional contacts were appearing throughout the system, each one broadcasting its own psychic corruption and adding to the cumulative effect that was gradually overwhelming the consciousness of every non-human in the facility. Captain Vasquez checked a display on her wrist and nodded to herself. The advanced fleet will arrive in approximately 6 hours. The main invasion force will be here within 48 hours. The Council has that long to decide whether it wants to cooperate with humanity's defense preparations or be bypassed entirely. Bypassed, Veltar demanded, though her voice carried the first hints of the artificial serenity that indicated early-stage psychic compromise. Humanity has been preparing for this scenario for decades, Captain Vasquez replied. We have contingency plans that assume the Council will be either unable or unwilling to mount an effective defense. We can implement those plans with or without Council cooperation, but it will be much easier with your help. She gestured to her displays, showing fleet movements and resource allocations across human space. But these weren't the limited forces that the Council believed humanity possessed. These were armadas numbering in the hundreds of thousands, equipped with technology that made Council vessels look like primitive toys. While you've been debating our punishment for violating your laws, we've been building the largest military force in galactic history. Every human colony that you ordered evacuated has become a fortress world. Every violation of your technology restrictions has been part of a massive research and development program. Every act of rebellion has been preparation for the war you refused to believe was coming. The assembled representatives were beginning to understand the true scope of their situation. The trial hadn't been about whether humanity would submit to Council authority. It had been about whether the Council would acknowledge reality in time to save itself. Dr. Webb was studying readings from the approaching Devourer ships when he made a connection that filled him with new dread. Elena, the psychic corruption patterns. They're not just random. They're being directed by something intelligent, something that understands our psychology well enough to craft specific mental attacks for each species. Captain Vasquez nodded grimly. The Devourers don't just absorb civilizations. They learn from them. Every species they've consumed has added to their understanding of how consciousness works. They know exactly how to break each type of mind because they've done it thousands of times before. She paused, allowing the implications to sink in. There's something else you need to understand. The approaching fleet isn't just Devourers. It includes ships and personnel from every species they've absorbed over the past 1,000,000 years. When you look at those vessels, you're seeing the corrupted remains of civilizations that were once just as advanced and confident as your own. The displays showed enhanced sensor readings of the approaching fleet, revealing design elements from dozens of recognizable species. Ships that incorporated Zephyrian crystal technology, vessels based on Altarian organic principles, even hybrid constructs that used Council standard components in ways that their original designers had never intended. They're using our own technologies against us, High Judge Zarthal observed, his ancient mind struggling to process the implications. Everything we've learned, every advancement we've made, it becomes a weapon in their hands. Exactly, Captain Vasquez confirmed, which is why traditional defensive strategies are doomed to failure. You can't fight an enemy that knows your technology better than you do, and has had millions of years to perfect countermeasures for every tactic you might use. The situation in the council chambers was deteriorating rapidly. More personnel were walking toward the docking bays with expressions of blissful compliance, while automated systems throughout the station were beginning to display the same surrender messages that the scout ship had been broadcasting. Even the translation matrices were being corrupted, occasionally rendering normal conversation in languages that hurt to hear. Sarah found herself thinking about the species that humanity had liberated over the past decades. The Kythera, the Voldris, the Solarans, and others. All of them had representatives within the human fleet. All of them had been learning human resistance techniques. All of them had been preparing for this moment. "What about the species we've helped?" she asked. "The ones you're planning to relocate as part of our punishment?" Captain Vasquez's expression became fierce. "They're not going anywhere. Every species that has chosen to work with humanity has been offered the same cognitive enhancements and resistance training that we've developed. About 60% of them show natural immunity to devourer influence, which makes them invaluable allies in the coming war." Advocate Prime Veltar attempted to stand, but her movements were becoming increasingly mechanical as psychic corruption spread through her consciousness. "You're describing the creation of an entirely new civilization based on resistance to higher forms of consciousness." "We're describing evolution," Sarah replied, understanding flooding through her as she saw the full scope of what humanity had been building. Not just biological evolution, but conscious, directed development of new capabilities. We're not trying to preserve the galaxy as it is. We're trying to transform it into something that can survive what's coming. The scout ship had reached the edge of the station's defense perimeter, and its presence was now affecting even the basic life support systems. Gravity fluctuated randomly. Atmospheric processors began producing gases that induced hallucinations, and the artificial gravity systems started orienting toward directions that didn't exist in normal three-dimensional space. "Time's up," Captain Vasquez announced. "The advanced fleet is beginning its approach, and I need to coordinate our defensive response. The Council has exactly 1 minute to decide. Do you officially grant humanity emergency authority to coordinate galactic defense, or do we implement our contingency plans without you?" High Judge Zarthul struggled to form coherent thoughts as psychic corruption invaded even his ancient consciousness. Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of species were either walking zombie-like toward surrender points or collapsing as their minds rejected reality entirely. Only the humans remained unaffected, standing like islands of sanity in a sea of growing madness. "What were your contingency plans?" he managed to ask. Captain Vasquez's smile was terrible to behold. "We removed the current council government by force, implement martial law across all member systems, and draft every available resource into a war economy designed around the total defeat of the Devourer invasion. Civilian populations are relocated to fortress worlds, industrial capacity is converted to military production, and anyone who resists our authority is classified as a security threat." She paused, her voice taking on an edge that made even the psychically corrupted representatives look up in alarm. "We spent 47 years playing by your rules while preparing for this war. But if you force us to choose between your political sensibilities and galactic survival, we will choose survival. And we will not ask permission again." The minute passed in silence, broken only by the sound of surrender broadcasts echoing through the station's communication systems. When no formal response came from the council judges, Captain Vasquez nodded to herself and activated a control on her wrist. Throughout human space, fleets that had been waiting in hidden bases began emerging into normal space. Defense platforms that had been disguised as asteroid mining stations revealed their true purpose. Colony worlds that the Council had believed were failing agricultural experiments transformed into fortress systems bristling with weapons that incorporated the most advanced technology the galaxy had ever seen. "Operation Prometheus is now active," Captain Vasquez announced to the chamber. Human forces are assuming emergency authority over galactic defense. All Council military assets will be integrated into our command structure. All civilian populations in threatened systems will be evacuated to designated safe zones. All industrial capacity will be converted to war production. She looked directly at the camera, her image being broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. This is not a coup. This is not conquest. This is survival. The galaxy you knew is over. The war for the galaxy that will exist begins now. Sarah watched the displays, showing the true scope of human preparations, and felt a mixture of awe and terror. Humanity hadn't just been preparing for war. They had been preparing to become something entirely new, something capable of fighting and defeating an enemy that had consumed entire galaxies. The question now was whether the rest of galactic civilization would have the courage to transform alongside them, or whether humanity would be forced to save them despite themselves. Either way, the age of Council authority was over. The age of human hegemony had begun, and somewhere in the approaching darkness of space, the Devourers prepared to discover that their latest target was going to fight back in ways they had never encountered before. The first major engagement occurred in the Arcturus system, 43 light-years from the Council chambers. Admiral Marcus Kane, commanding the human battleship Retribution, watched as the Devourer Advance fleet materialized in space like a cancer spreading across the star field. 300 vessels of impossible design, each one a fusion of organic matter and corrupted technology that defied conventional understanding of physics. All ships implement Protocol 7, Kane ordered. His crew, a mixture of humans and allied species who had undergone the same resistance training, moved with practiced efficiency despite the psychic pressure radiating from the enemy fleet. Remember, they're not just trying to destroy us. They're trying to convert us. The human fleet that faced the Devourers bore no resemblance to anything in Council databases. The ships were larger, faster, and equipped with weapons that seemed to operate on principles that normal physics shouldn't have allowed. Most unsettling of all, they appear to be partially alive, their hulls shifting and adapting in response to enemy tactics. Contact established with enemy command vessel, reported the communications officer, a Vuldress named Skeltar, whose natural telepathic abilities had been enhanced with human-developed defenses. They're broadcasting surrender demands in 17 languages simultaneously. Put them through, Kane ordered. The main screen flickered with images that hurt to look at directly. The Devourer commander appeared to be a fusion of several different species, its consciousness a collective of absorbed minds speaking with unified purpose. We are the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 civilizations. It spoke in voices that harmonized across impossible frequencies. Your resistance is meaningless. Your defiance will become our strength. Submit to perfection. Admiral Kane smiled, an expression that made even his own crew members step back nervously. I have a message for you from humanity and our allies. We've been waiting for you for a very long time, and we're going to show you what happens when you try to assimilate a species that refuses to be perfect. The battle that followed rewrote the rules of space warfare. The Devourer ships moved like living creatures, their hulls flowing and adapting to incoming fire, while their weapons reached out with tendrils of corrupted energy that sought to infect human systems. But the human ships moved like predators, their enhanced crews anticipating enemy tactics and responding with countermeasures that the Devourers had never encountered. Target their consciousness nodes, Kane commanded. Remember, these aren't just ships. They're floating cities full of absorbed minds. We need to disrupt the collective intelligence that coordinates their actions. The human weapons were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Instead of traditional energy beams or kinetic projectiles, they fired concentrated bursts of what could only be described as aggressive consciousness. The rounds penetrated Devourer hulls not by breaking through armor, but by convincing the ship's organic components that they didn't want to maintain structural integrity. Direct hit on the command vessel, reported the weapons officer. Their coordination network is fragmenting. Individual ships are beginning to act independently. The effect was immediate and devastating. Devourer ships that had been moving in perfect coordination suddenly began attacking each other as different absorbed personalities fought for control. The collective consciousness that had made them nearly invincible was fragmenting into thousands of individual voices, each one screaming for dominance. But the Devourers adapted quickly. The surviving vessels began implementing new coordination protocols, their collective consciousness evolving in real time to counter human tactics. Within minutes, they were functioning as a unified force again, their weapons now specifically calibrated to target human consciousness-based defenses. "They're learning our techniques," Skeltar reported, his voice strained as he fought off psychic attacks that would have driven most beings insane. "The collective is analyzing our countermeasures and developing responses. Then, it's time to show them what we learned from studying their technology," Kane replied. He activated a control that he had hoped never to use. "All ships, implement Project Lazarus." Throughout the human fleet, volunteer crew members began undergoing a transformation that would have horrified the old council. Using technology derived from devourer neural networks, they allowed their consciousness to be temporarily merged with the ship's control systems. They became living weapons, their human stubbornness and refusal to submit combined with the raw processing power of hybrid consciousness. The results were immediate and terrifying. Human ships began moving with impossible coordination, as if they were controlled by a single massive intelligence. But unlike the Devourer collective, this intelligence was founded on individual choice and voluntary cooperation rather than absorption and domination. "This is Admiral Kane to all human forces." He broadcast on channels that reached across the galaxy. "Lazarus is active. We're no longer fighting as separate ships and crews. We are fighting as humanity itself, unified by choice rather than compulsion." The tide of battle turned as the human fleet began demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't have existed. Ships' phase shifted through solid matter, weapons fired around impossible corners using folded space-time, and, most shocking of all, damaged vessels began repairing themselves using the absorbed matter from destroyed enemy ships. Meanwhile, in the council chambers, the surviving representatives watched the battle feeds with expressions ranging from awe to horror. The humans weren't just fighting the Devourers. They were becoming something new and terrible in the process. "They're turning themselves into weapons," whispered Dr. Webb, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The consciousness merging, the technological integration, they're voluntarily becoming what the Devourers force on their victims. Sarah watched the battle feeds and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's failing life support. The humans fighting in Arcturus were still recognizably human, but they were also something more. Something that could stand against the collected wisdom of 10,000 civilizations and force it to retreat. "Elena," she said to Captain Vasquez's image, "what have we become?" Captain Vasquez's expression was grim but determined. "We've become what we needed to become to survive. The question is whether the rest of the galaxy is ready to make the same choice." The Devourer Advanced Fleet was in full retreat now, their collective consciousness damaged and fragmented by weapons designed specifically to target their most fundamental strength. But their retreat wasn't a defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal to allow the main invasion force to adapt their tactics. "The main fleet will arrive in 18 hours, Captain Vasquez announced to the assembled representatives. "They will have analyzed our capabilities and developed countermeasures. The next battle will be much harder." High Judge Zarthal, his consciousness partially restored by proximity to human resistance fields, struggled to form coherent thoughts. "The cost, the transformation you're describing, is it reversible?" Captain Vasquez considered the question. "Some of it. The consciousness merging can be undone, though the experience changes people permanently. The technological integration is mostly reversible, though some enhancements become permanent by choice. But the psychological changes, the development of resistance to external influence, those are permanent. She gestured to the battle feeds, where human ships were now hunting down the last fleeing devourer vessels with predatory efficiency. We're not the same species we were 47 years ago when you first contacted us. We're not even the same species we were this morning when this trial began. We've become something new, something that can fight impossible enemies and win. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't offering to defend the galaxy. They were offering to transform it. Every species that accepted human protection would be changed by the process, enhanced with capabilities that would make them stronger, but also fundamentally different from what they had been. And if we refuse, asked Veltar, whose consciousness was slowly clearing as the immediate devourer influence receded, then you'll face the invasion with the same capabilities that have failed every other galaxy the devourers have attacked, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her as she saw the full scope of humanity's strategy. You'll maintain your current form, your current limitations, and your current weaknesses, and you'll be consumed just like everyone else. Captain Vasquez nodded. This isn't just a war for survival. It's a war for the right to evolve. The devourers represent one path: forced integration, loss of individual choice, perfection through absorption. We represent another path: voluntary enhancement, chosen transformation, strength through diversity. The displays around the chamber showed the aftermath of the battle in Arcturus. The system was littered with the remains of Devourer's ships, their organic components already beginning to dissolve as their controlling consciousness fled. But mixed among the wreckage were pieces of human vessels, sacrifices made to achieve victory. The casualties? Dr. Webb asked quietly. 17 ships lost, 433 crew members dead, Captain Vasquez reported. But their consciousness patterns were preserved in the ship networks before their deaths. They chose to merge permanently with our fleet intelligence rather than face individual extinction. The concept was alien and terrifying to most of the assembled representatives. The humans weren't just willing to die for their cause. They were willing to transform death itself into another form of service. You're asking us to abandon everything we are, High Judge Zarthal said, his ancient voice carrying harmonics of profound sadness. Our individual nature, our species identity, our connection to our ancestral forms. We're asking you to become more than you are, Sarah replied. The galaxy is changing whether we participate in that change or not. The Devourers represent one form of evolution. We represent another. The only choice is which path we take. The emergency session continued as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Human forces were engaging Devourer scouts in dozens of systems, each battle revealing new capabilities on both sides. The war that had been inevitable for decades was finally beginning, and it would determine not just who survived, but what form that survival would take. I need formal authorization to implement full transformation protocols, Captain Vasquez announced. Every species that chooses to stand with us will be offered the same enhancements that we've developed: consciousness resistance training, technological integration, enhanced coordination capabilities. But the process is irreversible, and it will change you permanently. Around the chamber, representatives huddled with their advisors and emergency government contacts, trying to make decisions that would affect the future of their entire species. Some, like the Frontier Alliance worlds, had already been working with human resistance cells and were ready to accept full integration. Others, particularly the older hegemony species, were horrified by the prospect of voluntary transformation. How long do we have to decide? Asked Representative Mexiel of the crystalline synthesis, his artificial consciousness already showing compatibility with human enhancement techniques. The main Devourer fleet will arrive tomorrow, Captain Vasquez replied. After that, anyone who hasn't accepted enhancement will be defenseless against their influence. We can provide some protection through proximity effects, but direct resistance requires individual enhancement. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The Council had hours to choose between accepting radical transformation under human leadership or facing annihilation at the hands of an enemy that had never been defeated. "There's something else you need to understand," Captain Vasquez continued. "The Devourers aren't just attacking this galaxy. They're part of a larger pattern of consumption that spans multiple galactic clusters. If we defeat them here, we'll become the next link in an even larger conflict. There are enemies beyond the Devourers, threats that make their capabilities look primitive." She showed displays of deep space observations that revealed the scope of the cosmic threat. Entire galactic superclusters going dark, reality itself being rewritten on scales that dwarfed anything the Council had imagined possible. "This isn't just about saving our galaxy," she said. "It's about creating a form of life that can survive and fight at cosmic scales. Humanity has begun that transformation, but we can't complete it alone. We need partners, allies, species willing to evolve alongside us into something that can face the infinite darkness." Sarah looked around the chamber at the representatives of dozens of species, each one struggling with the choice between safety and transformation. The old galaxy was ending, that much was certain. The question was what would replace it. "I vote yes," she said suddenly, her voice carrying across the chamber. "As the senior human representative, I formally request that the Council grant emergency authorization for humanity to coordinate galactic defense and transformation protocols." One by one, other voices joined hers. The Frontier Alliance voted as a bloc. Several individual species broke with their traditional alliances to support the measure. Even some hegemony members, faced with the prospect of extinction, chose adaptation over purity. But it wasn't unanimous. Several species chose to maintain their current form, preferring to face the unknown dangers of the invasion rather than accept certain transformation under human guidance. "The motion carries," High Judge Zarthel announced, his voice heavy with the weight of cosmic change. "Emergency authorization granted to humanity for coordination of galactic defense. May the cosmos forgive us for what we're about to become." Captain Vasquez smiled, but there was no satisfaction in the expression. "The real work begins now. Every species that voted for transformation will begin enhancement immediately. Those that chose to remain unchanged will be relocated to protected systems where we can provide what defense is possible." She paused, looking directly into the camera that was broadcasting her words across the galaxy. "To the Devourers listening to this transmission, know that you have made a fundamental error. You came here expecting to find another galaxy of isolated, frightened civilizations ready for absorption. Instead, you found humanity and our allies, united by choice rather than compulsion, enhanced by technology rather than enslaved by it." The displays around the chamber changed one final time, showing the true scope of human preparations. Fleets numbering in the millions, fortress worlds that could sustain themselves for centuries under siege, and, most importantly, billions of beings who had chosen transformation over extinction. "We are no longer the species you cataloged in your databases," Captain Vasquez continued. "We are evolution in action, consciousness choosing its own path, life refusing to accept limitations. You wanted to add our distinctiveness to your perfection. Instead, we're going to subtract your perfection from existence itself." The transmission ended, leaving the chamber in silence, broken only by the sound of ships launching from docking bays. The evacuation of unchanged species had begun, while those who chose enhancement were being transferred to specialized facilities where they would undergo the most radical transformation in galactic history. Sarah stood at the observation deck one final time, watching as the golden ring of the Council chambers slowly emptied. In 18 hours, the largest space battle in galactic history would begin. But, more than that, it would mark the birth of a new form of life, one that could stand against cosmic-scale threats and survive the infinite darkness between galaxies. The old galaxy was dead. The new galaxy was about to be born in fire. And, somewhere in the depths of space, humanity's true enemy was beginning to realize that they had finally, encountered prey that might prove to be predator instead. The war for cosmic evolution had begun.